Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Thursday, June 25th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives says it's entering a new era, one that resets how it regulates and enforces. And at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, nuclear technology is moving fast, and regulation has to keep up. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. The Senate Armed Services Committee is holding a hearing today to consider 4 nominees for senior Pentagon and intelligence positions, key jobs given that the Defense Department is managing a record $1.5 trillion budget request with big plans for its space and intel capabilities. The 4 nominees are Jay Hurst, tapped to be the Pentagon's comptroller, Matt O'Malley, nominated as the deputy overseeing defense acquisition and sustainment, Roger Mason, who would lead the National Reconnaissance Office, the spy agency that builds and operates America's intelligence satellites, and Eric Hernandez Baquero, who would become the Department of the Air Force's top official for space acquisition. Today's hearing helps move the needle on many of the national security vacancies that persist across the Trump administration. And Federal News Network's Rachel Cohen joins me with more details. Rachel, great to have you.
Thanks for having me, Terry.
All right, these are important hearings and important positions. Jay Hurst, let's start there. He's been running the Pentagon's finances without Senate confirmation since August of last year. So what's the big deal about finally getting a comptroller in place?
Yeah, it's the largest defense budget request in history. $1.5 trillion also includes $350 billion, with reconciliation. His background, he deployed to Afghanistan 4 times as an intel officer. He was an assistant secretary of defense for manpower and reserve affairs, so he has, experience at that level. And having a Senate confirmed comptroller matters, because it provides legitimacy and accountability in the budget rollout and in crafting that every year. And when negotiating with Congress, because acting officials can have less leverage with lawmakers.
He's also been leading the Pentagon's effort to get ready for a clean audit, something the Pentagon has yet to achieve. Do you think that'll come up as part of his hearing?
Probably. I think there are some people on the Hill who, that's top of mind for. But, going into the 27 cycle, and now that they've asked for $80 billion for conflict in Iran, there's a lot of ground to cover, right? So I wouldn't be surprised if, either they discuss it during the hearing or if it's in, the advanced policy questions that they give to all the nominees that lets them kind of dig in deeper than you would in person.
As you point out, though, he doesn't really come from a financial background. So do you think that will be an issue as they go forward?
It's hard to say. I think, he's been in this job for a little bit, so he has exposure, right? But, I think the Trump administration, that's not necessarily a disqualifier, right? They pick people that they want to see in those roles that they think have transferable skills, right? He's familiar with the defense enterprise. We'll see.
Well, let's turn our attention to Roger Mason then. He'd be running one of the most consequential intelligence agencies in the country. What does the NRO actually do, and why does this nomination matter right now?
Yeah, so he's the chief growth officer at defense contractor V2X. He used to be the assistant director of national intelligence for systems and resource analysis. He's worked at other contractors as well. So, he's coming in, or he would come in if confirmed, at a time of, very rapid pace in intelligence and space, figuring out how to leverage things like AI, machine learning, the commercial sector, to make space-based intel really robust. There's a lot of new threats that are popping up that the space-based intel enterprise is learning to deal with. So, he would ideally bring that background in private sector, bring that background from already having worked in government to move the ball forward there.
Well, two of the four nominees are directly tied to space. That one and Eric Hernandez-Baquero. What would his confirmation mean for how the military buys and fields space systems?
Yeah, so he also has a background in industry. He would come from Raytheon. He's currently VP for Space Intel, Surveillance and Reconnaissance, Space ISR. He worked at the NRO when he was in the Air Force. So he would become, the guy over all of, these multi-billion satellite radar, sensor programs. The Space Force, where obviously all of the space acquisition is centered in the Department of the Air Force, is really trying to ramp up, build out the things that they've been working on since they were established several years ago. And there haven't been a lot of people in his position yet, right? So I think he's taking the baton, if you will, from those other people and saying, how do we make this more permanent? How do we grow? How do we figure out how to do this cost effectively and quickly?
So a lot of push from Silicon Valley with the Department of Defense to speed space acquisition. What do you think the biggest trends are that he's going to be addressing?
I think they will likely get into things like jamming, adversaries that can block the satellites from talking to each other, block the satellites from talking to the ground, so on and so forth. How to, again, use AI and machine learning to bolster those capabilities, but also, assured access to space, right? The whole idea is, if a satellite goes down, how quickly can you get another one up? The goal is to have it be, very, very fast turnaround. And so I think he will be liaising, frequently with SpaceX, with the various companies that make, the payloads that go on those missions, and, say, how can we get even faster? How can we, reduce that cost even more?
Well, as we've just discussed, three of today's four nominees have fairly detailed public profiles in military service and industry jobs, prior government roles even. But Matt O'Malley, who's up for Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, is something of a mystery. Why is that notable, and why should our listeners care?
Yeah, it's actually pretty unusual to have somebody that, if you Google them, not a ton comes up for the federal government, right? And for a position this significant, the deputy oversees, hundreds of billions of dollars of spending on weapon systems, on everything, right? So it's a very closely scrutinized portfolio. So, he met with Senator Kevin Cramer a few weeks ago, so the Hill is starting to chat with him, kind of figure out, how somebody with his background could come in. My understanding, there's what I believe is his LinkedIn page. He's an intel officer in the Navy Reserve. He lives in Wisconsin. He has worked at the VA. He's worked at an investment firm. He worked at Special Operations Command as an XO. So, he has a defense background. Whether that translates into, overseeing arms buying enterprise of the largest military, one of the largest militaries in the world, we'll see how well that translates. But I do think the hearing will be, really the first time that the public has heard from him, or, really gets to see who he is.
Well, it's certainly an interesting slate of hearings, but as we know, just because you have a hearing doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get confirmed. And even if you do, it's probably not tomorrow. These hearings are happening just before the 4th of July recess. It's a lot of work on Capitol Hill. What's your expectation about the confirmation timeline?
We'll see. You're right. They're going out of town for a while. We've got summer recess coming up. We've got, the break for midterm elections coming up. Often they'll just kind of do a whole slate of people at once. It's not one-off votes on everybody. So people who aren't contentious, right? Or people who don't have things flagged that makes the Senate say, let's take a minute. I think they'll probably go through without much fanfare, but I don't know that we'll see it for another couple months unless something is fast-tracked.
That's Federal News Network's Rachel Cohen. Rachel, thanks for giving us this update today.
Thank you, Terry.
You can find her work at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives says it's entering a new era, one that resets how it regulates and enforces. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Tune in Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. for the Innovation in Government Show, sponsored by Carasoft. Hear from the industry leaders advancing the technologies shaping how agencies modernize secure operations and deliver better services. Innovation in Government covers what is changing now, what is working from cybersecurity and cloud to data, AI, and emerging technologies. Listen to Innovation in Government, Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. on Federal News Network. Search Innovation in Government.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. A new reform push at ATF aims to reduce friction for lawful businesses and owners while concentrating enforcement on willful violations. The challenge is maintaining that balance as expectations around safety and accountability remain high. Joining me to discuss ATF's shift in focus is the ATF Director, Robert Sakata. Director Sakata, it's great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much, Terry. Good morning.
You've described this as a new era of reform at ATF. Since you've been there, what have you noticed that really needed to change?
So I've been here at ATF for, this is my 21st year, but I've been working with ATF in a setting as a task force officer back since 1994. I was a police officer and detective in New York City, and we worked with ATF on violent crime and gang cases from that time. So I have a very long history of doing criminal enforcement work with ATF. So our folks are very much focused on violent crime and have been for a long time. There's only, to be very clear, there's two groups of folks here that are focused on different things. We have our industry operations investigators. They're focused on the regulatory side of what ATF does, and they're not actually involved they're not involved directly in any sort of criminal enforcement. They do work hand in hand with our agents, and they help to provide some information that they may glean from their inspections where they think that, for example, they could find some information that they could be helpful in a potentially a firearms trafficking investigation. But although their title says investigators, they are truly not investigating violent crime or conducting a firearms trafficking investigation. That's what the agents do. The agents conduct criminal investigations. So we both have very important but very distinct jobs. And ATF, I think, frankly, from my perspective, we're the only federal agency that works for the Department of Justice whose core mission is focused on violent crime. And that's violent crime committed by folks who illegally use firearms, folks that are gang members, prohibited persons, cartel members, illegal aliens, you name it. And in addition to areas of expertise in field of arson investigation, there are no other federal investigators in the United States that have the expertise that ATF does as it relates to arson. And then we also are tasked with conducting investigations related to the criminal use of explosives. There alone, we handle about 3,500 arson and explosive incidents every year around the country.
And so what are the reforms that you are focused on in your new era of reforms?
So in the area, specifically in the area of reform, during the last administration, there was quite a bit of effort set on creating regulations that were, frankly, I think, intended by the folks who put them together to try and reduce violent crime. Unfortunately, the regulations, as we all know, are followed by people that are law-abiding citizens, and all it does for law-abiding citizens is create additional burdens because gang members are not following regulations. Gang members get their firearms illegally in the first place. The regulations are not helping us prevent a shooting per se. It's just creating an extra layer of paperwork and process that's put on the American people who actually abide by the law very well, I think, and to include the members of the firearms industry who, for probably the last 20 to 30 years consistently, we've had a very low rate of folks that are not compliant with regulations. It's always less than 1% of the industry that we have some issues with. Some of it's malicious, and we prosecute those folks criminally. Some of it is just folks that are not capable of handling their business accordingly, and they're not thorough in the way they handle their business. And in that same vein, we try to work with those folks to bring them to a place that they are in compliance with the law. But if they can't do that, there's a point where not being able to handle your business accordingly and not being in compliance because you can't handle your business, you're also then putting the public safety at risk, and ATF has to hold you accountable for those violations as well. So again, the goal is not to put people out of business just for an administrative mistake. It's to hold people accountable who are maliciously involved in some cases, a very blatant conspiracy to traffic firearms to cartel members. And very often we get tips from the members of the industry daily about people that are involved in firearms trafficking, in particular, those businesses that have been around for a long time and do things all above board. They want to make sure that the industry around them is doing things the right way too. They've made their family businesses off of this and don't want to see the industry get a bad reputation as a result of someone not following the rules.
Robert Sakata is the director of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. Mr. Sakata, then how do you think about the balance of the ATF mission? Where does it spend most of its time between regulation, enforcement, and that partnership with industry?
So I think it's separate, right? As I mentioned, we have our criminal enforcement responsibilities and our industry responsibilities that happen at the same time. And the industry operations investigators in particular, they're focused on firearms and the explosives industry. We are tasked with regulating both. So those missions are carried out simultaneously. The portion of personnel that we have currently, we're somewhere around 670 or so industry operations investigators that are assigned throughout the country to conduct inspections of federal firearms and federal explosives licensees. At the same time, our agents are assigned. We have about just under 2,400 agents right now assigned around the country. In many cases, they're working currently part of the Homeland Security task forces with HSI and FBI and DEA. We're focused on violent crime in the cities that we have agents assigned to. So, which is pretty much all over the United States. And although there's a lot of cities that we've seen a tremendous reduction in violent crime, there's still a lot of cities that are impacted by violent crime, and they're also impacted negatively by domestic and international firearms trafficking. So that mission is carried out simultaneously, and we've carried that balance out for as long as ATF has been around. But I'll be frank, the last series of regulations under the last administration put ATF at great harm. It was not received well by the public. It was not received well by, frankly, both chambers of the House and Senate. So much so that ATF budget was threatened to be cut by almost $400 million in 2025, which would have resulted in ATF being shut down. We would have had to RIF 1,400 employees. And with 1,400 employees gone, there's no purpose in having an ATF anymore. We would not be able to carry out our mission. And that would be a waste of taxpayer money to keep an agency around like that. In that same vein, there was a overt discussion of moving thousands of agents to the FBI, 3 months later over to DEA. And then today we're still here. We're here. Why? We stayed focused on violent crime. We stayed focused on violent crime, and we worked integrated with the Homeland Security Task Force to do what we do best and stay focused on those areas that we make the biggest impact around the country in reducing violent crime and helping the communities that need us most. And as far as regulations go, we pretty much, as soon as the president put the Second Amendment executive order in play, we began following up on all of the regulations as directed to see where there was potential infringement or unnecessary burden placed on the American people who were not committing violent crimes. And we tried our best to propose regulations for the NPRMs that are currently out there. We had several also that were focused on the explosives industry. And we're trying to do that through a balance, right? It's tough. There's, the criminal element does what they do. The American people, for the most part, are good people, and they try to be in very much compliance with the law. And I don't think we can regulate or over create statutes to give us this fake sense of security. Bottom line, we have agents that are out there risking their lives every day. Just last week, our agents were involved in a shootout during an undercover deal. That didn't happen because my agents were not doing their job. That's happening because my folks are on the streets. This happened in Chicago. And, we were very fortunate. None of our agents were injured. But bottom line is this is a dangerous game that we're playing when we're focused on violent offenders, gang members, et cetera, who have no thought in getting involved in a shootout with law enforcement. If they have no concern about shooting it out with ATF agents, I can assure you they have no concern for the American public.
Certainly that is the exciting side of ATF, and I want to come back to the boring side, the regulation side, for just a minute. Putting out a package of 34 rules and regulations changes is no small feat. It's a lot of work to get that put all together, and you've been very clear that you think the focus is on easing regulation for the law-abiding public. Any concern that this regulation package puts public safety at risk, or how will you know as you watch it roll out that public safety has been protected even as the regulatory burden has been lifted?
So I think one of the things that we recognized and frankly shared with our leadership, because I was here during the last administration, we heard it from the public and the industry that they were dissatisfied with what steps we were taking to try and reduce violent crime. And that caused significant harm in the relationships that we have amongst the community and frankly, even law enforcement. Those law enforcement agencies that we've had probably the best relationships because we are on the ground working violent crime cases with our state and local partners, they were getting the negative side of, oh, you're working with ATF. That was causing them quite a bit of headache from their communities who felt that ATF was an agency that was, frankly, not doing their job. They were taking the easy road and holding good American people accountable for what the criminals were actually doing. So we put these regulations together, and there's a lot. There's 34 of them. 32 pertain to firearms. 2 are focused on explosives. The explosives regs, frankly, have been being worked on for a long time. There's a few more that, for whatever reason, some of these things take a long time to put together. Our attorneys and our experts under the enforcement programs and services here at ATF spent quite a bit of time putting these regulations together. We looked at the areas of risk, and I think we did a pretty good job. I think I mentioned that I've been doing this for 34 years. My goal is not here to appease anyone. I don't owe anyone any favors. I'm not seeking any political office. We are trying to do a good job, and we're also trying to do it by maintaining a balance where our agency, again, I believe, and maybe I'm biased, that we are the best suited to fight violent crime as it relates to firearms in this country. And I think if we can't thread that needle to stay in the middle of the road as much as possible and focus on the people responsible for violent crime, losing ATF as a tool that the government has would undoubtedly increase violent crime around the cities in the United States. And I think we tried to put these regs out with the greatest concern that, hey, did we miss something here that could put the public at risk? And I think we did a good job, but I'll be frank, that's what the purpose of these 90 days that folks have to review all of these regulations are for. We've set several stakeholder meetings with our state and local partners, the members of the different gun control organizations. We've met with some of the 2A groups. We've also met with, I'm sorry, I didn't meet with them yet, but I scheduled a meeting with the Conference of Mayors for next week so that we can hear from them as well. I was just at the Conference of Mayors in California last Friday, and I was asked about a couple of the regulations, and one in particular was a question related to, oh, well, now people can just buy guns online and have them delivered to their house. And that's not true. And I very politely said, hey, I'm not sure if you had the opportunity to read the entire regulation, but that's not what the regulation does. And there's some narratives that are out there that frankly are a little bit of fear mongering. Guns have been able to be ordered and delivered through the mail, I believe, for the last almost 30 years. People just didn't know about it, and we didn't have good processes in play. So we've modernized what we have today is a very robust system of using biometrics and virtual meetings like this, where we could identify who we're dealing with online, and an FFL could do the same thing to basically get a good ID as to who's involved in this transaction. But also, the gun is not delivered the next day. it's upwards of 2 weeks that it would take for a firearm to be delivered, which in many cases is a longer time period than when, for example, if I was in a conspiracy to go into a store and buy a gun on behalf of someone else, if I didn't have a criminal record and I had a concealed weapons permit, in some states I could walk out with that firearm immediately, and ATF wouldn't know about that transaction until days after that transaction. Here, in many cases, when an FFL believes there's a suspicious transaction that's occurring under their nose, essentially, they can let the transaction go on paper and make it a very prompt notification to ATF saying, hey, we think there's something wrong with this transaction. My agents then have upwards of 2 weeks to get involved in this and get on for example, an interdiction, in the sense of they can go out to the potential consumer and talk to that person and find out, hey, who are you? What are you buying this firearm for? Are you involved with any sort of other person that may be interested in this firearm? Are you planning on selling it immediately thereafter? There's a lot of things that can be done in that time period. And I think the more we have time to talk about these regulations, I use this one as an example, there's a lot more than what's in the title. And I think I would like people to focus on the content of the regulations versus what the title would say. Non-over-the-counter transactions sounds scary, right? Because it sounds like someone's walking in, they're ordering it, or I'm sorry, they're not walking in, they're ordering it on Amazon, for example, having it delivered within 4 hours, and there's no way to verify who that person is. That's just not what the process is. If it gets enacted, it's a much more robust process. And I like I said, I look forward to working with the rest of our stakeholders to try to alleviate their concerns. And frankly, if someone brings something forward that we missed and it would cause great harm or great risk to the public, we would obviously change our course of action. We're not going to keep driving ahead just to say we succeeded in what we push forward. That's not the intention here.
Robert Cicada is the director of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. I really appreciate your time today. Thanks for sharing all of the reforms that you're working on.
Thank you, ma'am.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, better decisions depend on data, but only if people can actually use it. But first, nuclear technology is moving fast and regulation has to keep up. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Time at the International Atomic Energy Agency gave Anna Bradford a broader view of how countries approach nuclear safety and innovation. Now back at the NRC, she joins me to share how she's applying those lessons as the U.S. navigates a new phase of reactor development. Anna, it's great to have you. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks so much for the invitation.
You are just coming back to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission after spending several years at the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA. First of all, why did you do that? And second of all, what did you learn there, especially in the international space, that you're bringing back to NRC?
Thank you. That's a good question. The International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA, as you said, it's a United Nations agency that deals with peaceful uses of the atom, essentially. And so it deals with a wide range of activities. I was there to deal with the safety of nuclear installations, whether it's nuclear power reactors, fuel cycle facilities, research reactors, specifically the safety side of those. It's very much in conjunction with what the NRC does in the U.S. The U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission does safety requirements and security requirements for domestic facilities, where the IAEA is promulgating safety standards internationally. And many countries rely very highly on those proposed regulations coming out of the IAEA. So there's a lot of synergy there in terms of the type of work that we do, the idea that you're protecting public health and safety when it comes to the use of nuclear materials. And so to me, it was an attractive thing to do, to take the experience I had gotten here domestically at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and take it to sort of the global level. It was really a good professional and personal learning experience. What did I learn coming back? I think that one thing I realized is that there is a lot of consistency in terms of requirements for safety for nuclear power and nuclear regulations and facilities. So I, again, was familiar with the U.S. approach to regulation. So when I went to this international organization, I thought there's probably going to be a lot of differences here in terms of what they require for facilities and what the U.S. requires for facilities. It's actually very, very similar. There was not a regulation or a requirement that I read at the IEEA that I thought, oh my gosh, that is so different than what we do in the U.S. It shows me that there's a lot of harmonization globally. There's a lot of agreement on what needs to be done for nuclear safety, and that regulators work together literally across the globe to make sure these facilities are safe.
As you bring that knowledge back, you're coming back into the position of the head of the Office of Nuclear Reactor Regulation. What do you think is going to be top of the agenda for you?
Well, so my office, we're going through a reorganization right now in the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and we're streamlining our activities and making sure we're staying focused on the right things. My office will be emphasizing its oversight of operating reactors, licensing of operating reactors. So not the advanced reactors or reactors that are in development or construction, but the ones that have been operating for 50, 60 years. We want to make sure those reactors are staying safe and secure. Security will also be in our office now. So that has to be our number one priority, regardless of the reorganization or anything else going on.
Well, talk to us about that reorganization for a minute. Why take on a reorganization within the NRC? What's the problem that is driving that?
Yeah, I'm not sure there's a problem. I think that the world is changing and we need to change with it. It's been quite a while since the NRC has undergone a major reorganization, and I think we want to align more with how nuclear technologies are evolving, with how the industry is evolving, with all the new information we have from the data we've gained from operations of reactors for literally decades. What have we learned from that and what can we apply now? So we think this reorganization will keep us focused on the right things.
And how do you see your new office fitting into that reorganization?
So as I mentioned, we'll be overseeing the operating reactors, but there will be other offices that are, for example, doing the permitting and the licensing of new reactors. There's a lot of exciting ideas out there of new types of reactor designs that have not really been licensed in the U.S. before, or only maybe one or two have been licensed. So they'll be doing that work. I will need to stay in close communications with the office director of that office to make sure we're staying in alignment on technical issues and permitting issues. So I think it's crystal clear to me that our office will stay focused on the safety of the operating reactors, regardless of what else is going on in the agency.
I'm speaking with Anna Bradford. She's director of the Office of Nuclear Reactor Regulation at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Anna, there's a lot going on in the nuclear power space. You talked about the long time operating models, and I have in my mind a mental picture of 3 Mile Island. Just goes to show you how old I am. But, we're hearing talk of portable reactors and containerized reactors and those sorts of things. And at the same time, there's a lot of international insecurity around nuclear materials. How do you see the work of the NRC right now in a space that is changing so rapidly?
That's a good point, and that fits into the comment I made that the world is changing and we need to change with it. 30 years ago, the only type of nuclear reactor, for the most part, was a very large one that was stationary that you built in one place. And now there's things like transportable reactors or small modular reactors, or there's talk of using essentially small modular reactors to power cargo ships. So now there's a lot of movement of these types, and the business model has become very international. And so we need to have also the perspective of that. What does that mean from a technical perspective, that this reactor might be small enough that you could throw it on the back of a pickup truck and take it somewhere else to use it? We need to take that into account during our technical reviews. And this is another reason to reorganize, to make sure we're focusing on the areas that need to be focused on in this new environment.
And as NRC adjusts then from the kinds of reactors that you're going to be focused on, these long-time operating single location ones, to this new portability concept, what has to change about the regulatory framework in that space?
I think we're moving towards a more performance-based model, which means we set the goals for what the designers or the operators need to achieve, the level of safety that they need to achieve it, and then they will explain to us how they plan to meet that level of safety. Because there are so many different designs, there's different ways to achieve the same goal. And so we need to allow them the flexibility to do that. These reactors are very, very different than the large light water reactors that have been in operation. And so we need to recognize that while still maintaining the level of safety that we have for the large reactors.
It seems to me that one of the keys of successful regulation in this space is community engagement. If you live downwind from a nuclear reactor, you care a lot about how that's operating. How is NRC and how will your office approach community engagement, making sure people know what's going on?
I agree with you. And community engagement has been very important to the NRC for a long time, since its formation, really. We have many avenues for public engagement. We have public meetings. We put out our documents for public comment. Often our public meetings are near the site that we're talking about. So, for example, one thing in my office is license renewal of nuclear power reactors. So if it's coming to the end of its original 40-year license, they can apply to operate for another 20 years, and we'll do a technical review, an environmental review, decide if that's safe. And if so, we will issue the license to them. And during that process, there are touch points, I'll call them, where the public can provide us our feedback with what they think about what it is we're proposing.
How does NRC interact with other federal agencies who might be in this space? We talked to folks at EPA not too long ago who had looked at environmental threats to significant infrastructure like reactors. How do you cross those organizational boundaries and make sure that you're staying streamlined?
It's very important. I agree with you. So we talk to the Environmental Protection Agency, for example, when it comes to radiation protection issues, because they have a lot of information and experience in that area. So we want to stay aligned with them when, for example, we set radiation protection limits. We also recently have increased our engagements with the Department of Energy because they're very involved in the development and research of new reactors, as well as the Department of Defense, because they're interested in using some of these small portable reactors to power, for example, maybe one of their remote bases. And so I would say our engagement with other government agencies, it's always existed, we've always done it, but it's increasing over the last few years.
And as you looked at the organization from the outside while you were at IAEA, and now you're coming back inside, are there particular areas that you want to make sure get addressed or connected or just, operate better?
I realized while I was at the IAEA, I had the opportunity to interact at a very high level with nuclear regulators across the globe. Those that both have mature nuclear industries, such as France, which gets 80% of its electricity from nuclear power plants, to those that are just now building their first reactors, such as Bangladesh or Turkey. And one thing I've realized is there are a lot of different ways to approach regulating a nuclear facility, and many of them can achieve the same results. So I think we need to be careful not to be insular and think that our way is the only way, because it is not. There's things we can learn from other countries. Many of them are under the same, I'll call them pressures, so with new reactor business models, new types of reactors, the pressure to do things in a more streamlined fashion and do it more quickly. So I think we can learn from them and they can learn from us, and I want to make sure we're doing that.
So I would imagine you're going to keep all those international friends close by. Easy,
absolutely.
High in your contact list?
Yes, I have all their business cards and I can reach out to them if needed.
Anna Bradford is Director of the Office of Nuclear Reactor Regulation at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Anna, it's been a delight to chat with you. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, better decisions depend on data, but only if people can actually use it. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. We're starting a new monthly series focused on how federal data works in the real world. Episode 1 looks at the Federal Data Field Guide, aimed at helping users sort through different data sets and put them to work. Joining me now for the Data Dish are Denise Ross and Chris Markham. Denise directs the Data Policy Institute at the Federation of American Scientists and is the former Chief Data Scientist of the United States. Dr. Christopher Markham is a Senior Advisor for Federal Data Policy at the Federation of American Scientists. Chris and Denise, I am so delighted to have you both. Thank you for joining me.
It's great to be here.
We are launching a new monthly series. We're going to call it the Data Dish, where we talk all about federal data. So Denise, you come from that background. When you look across government right now, what do you see as the state of federal data?
I see that federal data capacity has been incredibly weakened, and some of that's intentional, and some of it is really just collateral damage from the loss of so many federal employees, the contracts that support data collection and publishing, and the termination of federal scientific advisory committees that are so crucial for keeping our data collection systems modernized. There also is additional red tape, so things that used to be sort of routine for data stewards inside of federal government to do now require more clearance from political leadership. So although we've seen some pretty high profile terminations of data sets, including the food security supplement from USDA that was terminated right as millions of Americans were about ready to lose their SNAP food assistance benefits, the larger threat right now is really just the loss of capacity.
And Chris, that brings us to the Federal Data Field Guide. What problem is that trying to solve? What do people struggle with when they actually try to use the kind of data that Denise has just described?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So the Federal Data Field Guide, which Denise and I published in May of this year, it solves this sort of problem of how people, any wide set of stakeholders could learn about federal data. And often federal data are taken for granted. They're integrated into lots of all of the sort of our daily lives, like the weather data, for example, or the navigation data on your phone, your mapping apps use federal data. And the Federal Data Field Guide provides like a really sort of fun, whimsical way for anybody to get familiar with really 8 different categories of federal data. And it's a fun exercise. And I think part of what's happened with the losses in federal data capacity that Denise had just talked about, we feel a sort of a sense of sort of grimness around federal data right now. And the Federal Data Field Guide fills a little bit of a gap. It adds a little bit of whimsy to the conversation. You
mentioned 8 categories of data. Can you just hit those really quickly?
Yeah, so we've organized federal data really, I think, for the first time in a publication into an ontology. And the categories include statistical data, and that's data that measure population level characteristics. There's administrative data, geospatial data, scientific, accountability, evaluation, navigation data, and that's really data that helps citizens access government services, and then reference data. And so it's for those of us who love our libraries, but it provides information on standardized systems across the government.
Most people probably have no idea that there are that many different kinds of data.
Yeah, that's right. And what's really cool about the Federal Data Field Guide is that we recognize that not all data is going to fit into one of those categories. And in fact, many blend across the categories. And each of the categories has a little animal mascot that Denise and our assistant, Google Gemini, helped us create. And the overall mascot for the Federal Data Field Guide is the platypus, because it is an animal of many different other parts.
Love that. Denise Ross is the director of the Data Policy Institute at the Federation of American Scientists and the former chief data scientist of the United States. Dr. Chris Markham is senior advisor for federal data policy at the Federation of American Scientists. Denise, let me come back to you. Walk us through an example of how someone might use the Federal Data Field Guide.
I use these categories when I'm thinking about an issue that I'm working on. For example, June is Alzheimer's Awareness Month. And so if you think about like where do federal data sets support our understanding of Alzheimer's and help support Americans who are grappling with this disease? And when you do that, you go beyond the usual suspects. And that's what, I'd love to pass it over to Chris to talk about the most obvious data that we talk about when we think about Alzheimer's, and that would be data that look at Alzheimer's prevalence.
Yeah. So as Denise said, what's really nice about the Federal Data Field Guide is that we can think about data sets that are sort of timely and relevant, like in the context of brain health and Alzheimer's Awareness Month. We might think of something like the CDC's, of course, the National Vital Statistics System tells us like how many people die from Alzheimer's disease every year. And that's really the sort of blended data, one of these platypus data, because it's statistical data. We have a statistical release. There's also administrative data because it's pulled in from information we get from states on death data. There's also like this really important CDC data set on prevalence called the National Health Interview Survey. And in that, we learned that about 4% of the population over 65 has been diagnosed with dementia. And what's very sort of consistent with that is that another data set that's like really, I think it's just really cool. It's part of the Veteran Administration's Million Veterans Program. They've had basically the same finding in the veteran population. And that data are controlled access. They're not freely available to the public, but they're available for researchers at the Veteran Administration. And it's really provided key insights into the exposure that maybe Denise has more information on data sets that provide exposure risk for Alzheimer's.
Yeah, thanks. And another type of data set that informs our understanding of Alzheimer's and actually helps caregivers and patients is the navigation data that helps Americans navigate federally related resources. For example, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services Nursing Home Compare database. I like to name data sets by name, give them credit, and it helps individuals assess which nursing homes may be the best care for their loved ones. And this also is a platypus because it falls into the accountability category because it includes quality metrics on these federally supported facilities. And another data set that helps patients navigate federal resources is the clinicaltrials.gov data set at NIH, and that allows people to find what trials might be relevant for the stage of dementia that they are in.
So I can imagine that different constituencies are looking for different answers. If you're a patient or a caregiver, you're going to type into your search, where do I find help? Right? If you're a researcher, you're going to be looking at what are the prevalence issues and the conditions associated with it. How does a user of this data, who doesn't even know that they're a user of this data, find it?
I'm glad that you mentioned that, because in order for these data to serve their purpose, sometimes you don't even need to find it, really. So, for example, an important reference data set is from the Social Security Administration. They have a data set on medical conditions that qualify for what they call compassionate allowances, and that enables someone to fast track their disability benefits. So if you're a 45-year-old and you just got diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's and you apply for disability benefits with the Social Security Administration, you don't need to know that this reference data set exists. But because the young onset Alzheimer's disease is listed in this data set, you can get services, very quickly rather than having to wait the normal amount of time to get your benefits.
So, Chris, what happens in practice when someone tries to combine or use these different data sets from the field guide? Do they create their own platypus, or they have some other animal that's out there?
No, that's great, because in information policy and data policy in particular, we talk about something called fitness for purpose. And fitness for purpose is a really, really important concept because it describes when the data were originally approved for collection. What purpose did they fill? What role is this going to play in Americans' lives, and what services is the government agency that's collecting the data going to benefit from the data? Now, fitness for purpose makes a lot of sense on the original collection, but data have a life of their own. And sometimes, actually, I think often, we find that we can't anticipate what downstream uses public data are going to have. And yeah, in some cases, it means that you might combine different data sets. You can imagine, and sometimes agencies do this themselves. So there's a really impactful tool from the EPA called their Smart Community Database. And what they are able to do is link different data sets like the American Community Survey from the census to their own environmental data at the EPA and give information about, it's called Smart Location Database. It's part of their Smart Community program. And they're able to provide information on all kinds of environmentally informed location information about like how people are located close to transit, for example, if they need to get a job.
And so, Denise, we've talked about Alzheimer's data here today, and it's really important, but it's really just a teaser for this series. As we go along, we're going to come back to different pieces of the data ecosystem. Where are you going to plan to take us next?
Well, last October for Halloween, we had a piece on dearly departed data sets. And although it's not Halloween, we are going to be releasing a comprehensive update of data losses. So look forward to that. Also, I like to, coming out of New Orleans and Hurricane Katrina, I always like to keep an eye on my hurricane-related data. So as we head into peak hurricane season, we'll be covering federal data sets that relate to disaster response and recovery. And then of course, talking about the future of data policy. We're encountering some real new frontiers around the complexity of data and what our society needs from federal data. And that's the future of what we'd like to talk about.
Denise Ross is the director of the Data Policy Institute at the Federation of American Scientists and former chief data scientist of the United States. And Dr. Chris Markham is senior advisor for federal data policy at the Federation of American Scientists. Thank you both so much for joining me. I'm excited to kick off the Data Dish and see you again next month.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The White House is accelerating the government-wide transition to post-quantum cryptography. In a new executive order, President Trump directs agencies to meet hard deadlines for adopting the PQC algorithms that will protect data from a future quantum computer. For more, Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday joins me now. Justin, thanks for being here.
Good to be with you, Terry.
This EO is generating a lot of buzz, but for people who don't speak quantum, put it in plain English for us. What are the highlights from the executive order?
Sure. So this executive order directs agencies to really ramp up this transition to post-quantum cryptographic algorithms. And, cryptography protects data using math and algorithms and scrambling codes so that if that data is stolen by a bad actor, it can't be viewed. And so what this executive order is doing is focusing on the post-quantum cryptographic algorithms that the National Institute of Standards and Technology has already finalized, actually, within the last few years, even though a cryptographically relevant quantum computer, one that could break current encryption standards, isn't known to exist. But it's coming from all accounts, and it could be coming faster than people realize. And so what this executive order does is it sets a couple big deadlines for agencies to transition to those post-quantum cryptography algorithms for their really important systems that hold really sensitive data. It's December 31st, 2030 for implementing those keys on those systems, and then it's December 31st, 2031, a year later, for the digital signatures that protect things like emails. So those are the two deadlines that agencies now have to move to post-quantum cryptography for the systems that hold that sensitive data that they would really not want a bad actor, an adversary, to get a hold of and unscramble if they do develop a quantum computer here in the next few years. I spoke with Garfield Jones. He was the head of strategic technology at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency for several years. He now works at the quantum security firm Q-Secure. And he said that this executive order has really ramped up what was previously kind of just a planning exercise for federal agencies.
It really lights a fire under everyone to, hey, this is something that the government's taking seriously. Instead of people saying, oh, no, I'm not worried about it, it drops it right in the CIO's lap, like, hey, I've got to get this ready. It's not, this is not for somebody else's tenure for 10 years from now. It is my tenure now that I have to get this done.
Justin, does the EO explain who has the responsibility to lead this transition and guide agencies who may not know exactly what a transition to PQC means?
Yeah, so the Office of Management and Budget is going to take the lead on some new guidance to really detail how agencies should get this done. And that guidance is due within the next 90 days from OMB. So something to watch here this summer. And then each agency is actually required now to name a PQC lead. And this is someone who will report to the agency CIO on meeting the deadlines in this executive order and meeting all of the OMB guidance that is to come. And then the other big thing to come out of this is that the National Institute of Standards and Technology is tasked under this executive order with starting a pilot project that lays out what it looks like to migrate to PQC, that shows what it looks like to migrate to post-quantum cryptography. That pilot should start within the next 180 days, so about 6 months, and it should be done by the end of 2027 per the executive order. So that's something that's going to come together here relatively quickly and could be a pathfinder for the federal government.
Does the EO say anything about what contractors will be responsible for?
Yeah, this is a big deal. It actually directs OMB, NASA, and the General Services Administration to lead an effort to identify cost-saving opportunities in implementing the PQC migration strategy. And so those are the lead federal acquisition agencies, and they're going to look at things like cloud-based technologies, shared procurement of PQC tools, joint training programs, and centralized technical support. So that will all involve contractors. And then the order directs the Federal Acquisition Regulatory Council to develop rules requiring contractors to meet federal information processing standards that include the PQC requirements here by the end of 2030. And so they're kind of working on that same deadline as federal agencies to make sure that contractors that develop or service sensitive systems on behalf of the U.S. government or service sensitive data on behalf of the U.S. government are also protecting that data with post-quantum cryptography. And so that is definitely a rule that contractors should be watching out for here in the next year or two.
And this wasn't the only EO that came out. We have this PQC executive order, but there was a separate EO the president signed to advance quantum innovation. How did the two go together?
Yeah, it's interesting. The orders are seemingly pretty disparate, one focused on innovation and one on security. But, of course, the innovation one directs the Energy Department to lead an effort to develop a quantum computer here in the next couple of years that could lead to scientific breakthroughs. And so advancing kind of the science of quantum computing is kind of the other side of the coin to advancing security. Darren Guccione, he's the chief executive and co-founder of Keeper Security, pointed out to me that, establishing this big national quantum computing effort will advance security. That executive order also expands counterintelligence protection for domestic quantum infrastructure, invests in workforce development. So those are all things that are going to kind of intersect with this much more narrow push around post-quantum cryptography.
And as OMB gets ready to lead this deployment and transition effort, what are some of the gaps in these EOs that they're going to have to solve?
Yeah, so EOs are so high level that the implementation details that comes out from OMB, those will be really key here. And there are a few issues. One is, of course, funding. This is going to cost some level of money. Several years ago, under the Biden administration, OMB put out an estimate that the transition to the PQC standards for just the civilian side of government would cost roughly $7.1 billion over 10 years. And that is not something that agencies have really budgeted for. Cybersecurity programs are focused on much more near-term threats, on existing standards and requirements and frameworks. Post-quantum standards are just starting to become the broader kind of cybersecurity playbook. And so budgeting for this is going to be one thing that, we'll have to look out for in both agency budget requests and in appropriations bills. And then the implementation details, how agencies do this, is just not going to be straightforward. They're going to have to identify those most sensitive systems that hold really valuable data. They're going to have to sequence changes across those systems. Upgrading to post-quantum cryptography could potentially take those systems offline, and that could have cascading effects. And so this is going to be something that the agencies will have to work very closely and very carefully. And then finally, while this executive order focuses on high-value systems and assets, several folks pointed out that, agencies really need to focus on the specific data that they need to protect and what they need to prioritize here, because some data is only sensitive for a couple of years or, even less. But there's other data, plenty of data that the government holds that they will not want getting out there for 10, 20, even 50 years. And that's things like taxpayer data, of course, census data, and a whole range of other things. And so they'll have to figure out how to protect those data assets really closely and not focus on maybe the less sensitive stuff. I spoke with Garfield Jones about that as well.
those longer life cycle data elements need to be moved maybe to a more secure area, or we need to put longer keys on them because we still haven't implemented the algorithms yet. So between now and 2030 and 2031, we still have all that data that's still moving out, that's still being harvested. So what are we going to do about that?
It's Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday. Justin, I really appreciate you giving us a first look at these critical EOs. There's still going to be lots to watch.
My pleasure.
You can find Justin's story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.